The Wicker Man, Summer Isle, Maine, Saturday, April 27th, 2013. It was a usual spring day for the island of Summer Isle, a island located off the rugged coast of Maine, with a population roughly around or near 5,000. An island full of mystery, but it was an island well renowned for its bountiful crops. Well, this little island was about to have an outsider, a visitor, in the form of a deputy from the Hancock County Sheriff's Department, and he was pulling in to port in his department motorboat. The deputy turns off the motor and throws the anchor, and then he grabs his bullhorn and screams at the small crowd of onlookers on the dock, saying, "Ahoy there! My name is Deputy Neil Howie. I am a detective for the Hancock County Sheriff's Department. I need to speak with the harbor master." Then, among the group of the onlookers, was a very short man who looked older than water, and he grabs his bullhorn and he says back to the deputy, "Ahoy there, I am the harbor master. Just pull up to any one of the empty jetties and I will greet you." So the deputy pulls up to the jetty and he ties his boat to it, and then he gets off. Neil Howie was a man probably in his late 40s, early 50s. He was a very tall, somewhat heavy-set man, and he was there on an assignment. He comes up to the group of onlookers, greets them, identifies himself, and tells them what's his business. He says to them, "Good morning, everybody. I am Deputy Neil Howie. As I said, I am with the Hancock County Sheriff Department. I'm an investigative detective, and I'm here for a report of a missing child." And then Detective Howie grabs his notes and he says, "Yes, I'm here to investigate the disappearance of a Rowan Morrison, last seen April 18th. And then the onlookers, who were all men of varying ages, from men in their late 20s to men in their early 70s, were talking amongst themselves aloud, and one of them says, "Well, detective, the only Morrison that we know of on this island is May Morrison. She does have a daughter, Maggie Morrison, but she's only 8 years old." And then the detective pulls out a picture of Rowan Morrison. She was a typical little girl of 10 with a reddish brown hair and green eyes, and the onlookers got a closer look at the pictures, and they were all saying to the detective, "No, sir, we've never seen this girl on the island, and we know most of the kids on this island, unless she's somebody new that we haven't met yet." Then another of the onlookers asked the detective, "Okay then, Deputy Detective, who was the one that filed the missing persons report?" And Detective Howie says, "Well, man, it was an anonymous tip." And one of the older onlookers says, "Well then, Detective, we can't help you there." Then Howie asks one of the onlookers, "Then where is this May Morrison lady located at on this island?" And then another of the onlookers says, "Well, sir, May Morrison runs a confection shop just down the road here. She lives above it." And then the detective thanks the onlookers, and he walks down the cobblestone boulevards of the town. He had noticed the beautiful, sweet-scented perfume-like smell of all the spring flowers in bloom. It was a heavenly-looking place, this town, the kind of place you could raise your child without any issue, without any fear. As Detective Howie was walking down the street, he saw the shop of May Morrison. The name of the shop was Morrison Confection, and they sold everything from baked goods to homemade candies. And Detective Howie walks into the shop. Hearing the bell, May Morrison enters the main shop from the back. May Morrison was a somewhat heavy-set woman in her mid-30s with cherry blonde hair and brown eyes. And she greets the detective, and Howie introduces himself, and he says, "Good morning, madam. I am Deputy Neil Howie, detective for the Sheriff's Department, and I've come here to investigate a missing child's report. Detective Howie goes on to explain the further details of the case to Mae Morrison, and then he finally ended up showing the picture of Rowan. Mae grabs the picture, looks at her, and she says, "No, this is not my daughter." And she goes on to explain to the detective, "My daughter is Maggie. She's in the back right now coloring pages." And she goes on to explain to the detective, "You may go back and ask her questions. Maybe my daughter played with her, but I don't know of any Rowan Morrison or any other people by the same last name as me on this island." So May guides Howie to the back of the shop where there was an office area, and there was little Maggie just painting away at a coloring page of a rabbit. And then May leaves the room, and Howie does this thing, introduces himself to the little girl, shows her the picture, asks her the question, and the answer was the same. Little Maggie has never seen or heard of Rowan Morrison before. And then Howie, trying to get a little more information out of the little girl, compliments her on her skills to paint with watercolor. And then the little girl smiles at him and she says, "Thank you, sir." And then she invites Howie to paint with her. She hands him a brush with brown watercolor paint, but she accidentally handed him the brush side, and he got a streak of brown watercolor paint on the palm of his hand. And the little girl says, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, sir." And then he joins the little girl in painting the rabbit, and he says to her, "I'm sure there's a lot of rabbits out here." And then the little girl says, "That's not a rabbit, detective. That's a hare, you silly man." After the brief painting session, Howie just went on through the majority of the day, asking the same questions over and over, and getting the same answers over and over. Finally, the evening was coming. He needed a place to sleep, and the locals told him about a tavern called the Green Man Inn. It was an old-fashioned tavern where the bar was on the bottom and the rooms to stay in were on the top. And the tavern was full, like it was every night, with the usual amount of patrons in there, drinking, eating, and just enjoying life after a hard day of working out in the fields. But then the tavern got quiet as Detective Howie walks in. He was a stranger in town, and nobody's seen him, but they've heard of him already. The sheriff detective who was investigating a missing girl who no one's seen or heard of. Well, Howie also noticed the quietness as he walked into the tavern. He didn't like it at all, but he understood he was a stranger in town. And he walks up to the register and asks the bartender, who was also the owner of the establishment, asking him, "Do you have a room for a few days?" And then the man at the register, who was a man in his mid-50s, about average height, bald, and a big beer belly, says to the detective, "Yes, but you have to be more specific, detective. How long do you actually plan to stay here?" And the detective says to the bartender, "I really don't know, so I'll just pay you as I go along," he says. And the bartender says, "Fine," and he tells Detective Howie, "That'll be 1:30 a night." And the bartender asks Detective Howie, "So are you paying this, or is the sheriff department paying this?" And Howie says, "That's going to be the sheriff department. You'll be paid in full," he says. "Don't worry." And then the bartender hits a bell, and a very radiant young woman comes walking down the stairs. She was maybe 5'7", 5'8", honey blonde hair, blue eyes, a little bit of freckles on her face. But she was a catch for any man who was lucky, thought Detective Howie in his head. And then the woman identified the bartender as her father, saying, "Yes, Dad?" And the bartender says to her, "Belle, this is Detective Neil Howie, a sheriff's detective for the sheriff's department. Just take his bags to room 6. And she says, "Yes, Dad." And then she grabs the suitcases of the detective and guides him to room 6. As soon as they got into the inn room, It was just a typical room that you find in any inn, except for one modern feature in there. There was a small bathroom that Detective Howie was very thankful for. And then Belle asked Detective Howie, "Will you be taking dinner, Detective?" And Detective Howie says yes. And then Belle says to the detective, "I will go downstairs and prepare your dinner." And then the two of them walk down together. And as soon as Belle got back downstairs, the men at the tavern began to sing a random song called The Innkeeper's Daughter, much to the flattery of Belle. Well, after the song was over, Detective Howie began to ask all the patrons at the tavern about Rowan Morrison. He even pulled out the picture, and they all gave the same answer: never heard of her. Afterwards, Belle comes back into the tavern and she says, "Detective, your dinner's ready." So Detective Howie follows Belle to the small dining area and back, and there was a very delicious dinner plate of chicken, some beans, and some chopped up potatoes seasoned with parsley and other seasonings. And on the side was some applesauce, apple fritters, and pear cobblers to round out the dinner. Well, Neil Howie sits down, puts the napkin on his lap, and he begins a very long prayer. Belle looked at him strangely as he was praying, and then after his prayer was over, he begins to eat. After he ate the main dish, then he worked his way to the apple and pear delights. That's when he noticed that the applesauce, the apples that made the fritters, and the pears that made up the pear cobblers were not locally grown. Then Howie raises his head up and asks Belle, "What's going on? This is not locally grown apples and pears." And then Belle pauses for a moment, like she was looking for an excuse, and then she says to the detective, "Well, I think all the apples and pears that we grow were already shipped out." And then Neil Howie says to Belle, "Oh, darn. I was looking forward to this. This island is very renowned for its best tasting apples and pears." And Belle says, "Oh, I'm aware of that. A lot of people come here during the harvest to buy and eat," she says. And then she walks off. After his delicious dinner, Howie decides to have a evening walk before he settles in for the night. So he gets up and he tells the bartender as he walks by, saying, "I'm going out for a walk. I'll be back in a few minutes." So Howie leaves the tavern and walks down the darkened cobblestone streets. The only streetlights were centered around the town. Outside the town, the roads were pitch black, and Howie walked down the streets. It was a cool night. The stars were out, and crickets were singing all over the place. It was very beautiful, and as he was walking, he had noticed a bright object in a nearby field. Ever curious, he decides to get a closer look, and as he got closer, he noticed that the light was just a giant bonfire. Bonfires were common, usually a bunch of teenagers having a party out in the field, drinking illegally. So he decides to get a even closer look to make sure that there was no underage drinking going on. And as he got close to the bonfire, he saw in horror. Illuminated by the firelight were naked bodies writhing around in the ground, and he puts his hand over his mouth in shock. It was an orgy, just out in the open like that. And then Detective Howie quickly turns around and storms back to the tavern. He could have easily had arrested everybody, but he did not know what's really going on. All these little islands off the coast were very isolated and had their own bizarre traditions. He's heard the stories before, but this just took the cake in his mind. Howie was a deeply conservative religious man. He was an evangelical Christian, and there was little room in his mind for other religious beliefs. As he finally made it back to the tavern, he scolds everybody at the tavern, screaming, "You people are weird, perverted. Right now, as you're just getting drunk and singing, there is an orgy going on down the road there, and no one knows about it, or if they do, they don't care about it. This town, oh no." And then he tells the bartender, "I'm going to my room. I do not want to be disturbed." And he stomps up the stairs in anger. Later, Howie was in his pajamas, getting ready for bed. As he was about to kneel down in prayer, he overheard someone calling Belle from outside. He opens his windows to see, and he could see a dark figure out in the gardens behind the tavern. All he could make out of the figure was that he had a red kilt on, and there was a young boy standing next to him. This boy was probably 13 or 14, and he says to Belle from the garden, "So, my queen, are you ready for tonight?" And she says, "Yes, and I see you brought me a very handsome young man." The young teenage boy lets out a very big smile, and then she asks the boy, "What's your name?" And the young boy says, "My name is Taylor." And then she says, "Come on, Taylor, I'm waiting for you." And sure enough, Taylor walks nervously to the back entrance of the tavern, and as he enters the tavern grew silent. Everybody was looking at him, and suddenly everyone began to applaud young Taylor. It was evident what was going to happen between Belle and Taylor. Even in the modern era, there are some cultures that do this to boys so they can become men. Meanwhile, in his room, Detective Neil Howie was praying hard, and he was praying for the salvation of the island. After he was done, he gets into bed. He could do very little sleeping from the noise coming next door from Belle's room. And as he was just waiting for the two to get done doing what they were doing, Neil Howie's mind was just drifting away in thought, thinking back to the nasty divorce he had with his first wife that happened fairly recently. Well, she left him because she got tired of Neil Howie's constant political tirades. His tirades were so much that it was also affecting his co-workers at the sheriff's station. And then Howie began to think about his new woman in his life, the woman he intended to marry. She was a good, God-fearing evangelical woman just like him. And he met her at a revival meeting, and the two hit it off, and they were intending to marry in 3 weeks. Then Howie's mind drifted to the case he was investigating, about this mystery girl that disappeared and no one's seen or heard of her before. But Howie was a very good detective, and he was going to solve this mystery if it was the last thing he did. That morning, Howie wakes up and he gets himself groomed and gets on his detective uniform, and he heads downstairs to have some breakfast. The tavern was very quiet. There were other people there also having breakfast. And then after his breakfast was over, Howie wipes his mouth, gets up, leaves money on the table, and walks out to continue his investigation. As Howie was walking by one area of the town, he noticed the ruins of an old stone church. It looks like this church has been abandoned for many, many decades, maybe a century or two. He could see the cemetery next to the church, which had many old headstones. And then he saw a new section of cemetery, but there were no headstones. There were just bushes. And then he thought to himself, who would use bushes and plants as grave markers? Then he sees a group of people in the new section of the cemetery. They were all robed in white and some very ornate jewelry, and it looks like they were carrying out some ritual. And Howie thought to himself, what the devil's going on this island? It seems everybody here is mad. They're way too permissive out here. Orgies in the middle of the night. Ugh. The sight of what he saw the night before was still sickening to Howie. Well, Howie decided to make his way to his destination, the local school. Maybe they would have records about Rowan Morrison. As Howie finally made it to the outskirts of the school, he saw a bunch of young boys led by one adult, that were dancing around the maypole. And he could see that one of the young boys had climbed to the very top of the maypole and put some sort of wreath on the top of it. And the boys were singing a song and dancing around the maypole as the adult man who was leading them was playing some sort of mouth instrument and leading the song verses. Howie finally made it to the schoolhouse. It was your typical old-fashioned schoolhouse. 2 classrooms. One was for first grade through 5th, and the other half was for 6th through 8th grade. Well, Howie walks right into the classroom as the little girls in the classroom were moving to the beat of the song outside. It seems that the maypole dancing was just reserved for the boys. Well, after the festivity concluded outside, the teacher then asked the students, "All right, children, what does the maypole symbolize?" And then one little girl raises her hand in the classroom, and the teacher points to her, and the little girl answered, saying that it represented a phallic symbol, which shocked Neil Howie as he heard. And then the teacher says, "Very good." And then she goes on to explain in the lesson that the maypole was a giant phallic symbol, which horrified Neil Howie, and then he made his presence known, and everybody looked at him, and he introduced himself to the classroom, and then he asked the teacher to come with him outside. The teacher was a young woman in her 30s who had brown hair and gray eyes. She was very attractive, and she followed Howie outside. And then Neil Howie asked her the question, "Have you seen this girl?" And he showed the picture of Rowan Morrison. And the teacher looked at the picture hard, and then she gave it back to the detective. And she says, "No, Detective Howie, I have not seen this girl." And then Detective Howie says to the teacher, "Oh, by the way, you failed to introduce yourself to me." And then the teacher says, "Oh, yes, silly me. My name is Mrs. Amanda Benson," she says. And then she goes on to say that she has no such girl in her class. And then Howie says, "Well, Mrs. Benson, if you don't mind, I'm going to check your attendance book to see if that's true." And then Mrs. Benson says, "Go ahead, detective." And then the detective walks back into the classroom. He had noticed all the boys that were dancing outside were back in the classroom in their seats. And then Howie walks right up to the attendance book and sees Rowan Morrison's name. He looks further back and sees the last time she attended school was April 18th. And then he slaps the attendance book shut and he looks at the teacher and he says, "Mrs. Benson, according to this book, you do have a student here by the name of Rowan Morrison." And then Howie scans the classroom and sees an empty desk in the middle of the classroom. But before he investigated the empty desk, he tells the students of the classroom that he was investigating the disappearance of Rowan Morrison, and he would appreciate their cooperation. The kids all nodded their head no. And then Howie walks to the empty desk in the middle of the classroom. He opens the desk to reveal that it was empty inside except for one object, actually 2 objects. It was a nail driven into the desk, and tied around the nail was some sort of black string. And tied to the black string was some sort of small black beetle walking around in circles. And when the little girl sitting next to the desk sinisterly tells what it meant, Howie got very upset and walked out of the classroom. He signaled for the teacher to come with him, and the teacher followed him back outside, and then he starts berating the teacher on what she was teaching and the poor behavior of these students. And then the teacher says to Howie, "Well, I'm sorry, detective. We do have a missing girl named Rowan Morrison, but she's not missing. She's dead. And her death affected everybody here," she says to the detective, and she goes on to explain. "Her death really shocked this community. We're a very close-knit community out here," she says to the detective, and she goes on to further explain to the detective, "Well, now that she's beyond the veil, we try to move on with our lives and act like she never existed. it's helping the kids cope her sudden loss. And then the detective asks the teacher, "We mean beyond the veil." And then the teacher explains, "Well, we don't like the word death around here. It's so final. We like to think of it as a transition period from one plane of existence to another. You cross beyond the veil once you leave this existence." Howie, being the devout evangelical Christian man he was not having none of it, and then he threatens a teacher, saying to her, "Once I get back to the mainland, I am going to report you to the county and shut the school down." And then he asks the teacher, "Where's your local preacher at?" And then the teacher says, "Well, we don't have a preacher," she says to Howie, and she goes on to further explain to Howie, "We haven't had a Christian minister on this island in nearly 200 years. It's a very long story," she says. And then Howie's like, "Well then, where is this Rowan Morrison buried at?" And the teacher says, "Well, Rowan is buried at the new section of the cemetery." And the teacher explains to Howie, "You can ask Arthur. He's our local undertaker, and he knows every grave by memory." Well, then Howie walks away angrily. He finally arrives to the cemetery, and he sees the undertaker was mowing the lawn. He walks up to the undertaker and asks the undertaker about Rowan Morrison's grave. The undertaker lets out a smile and guides the detective to Rowan's grave. Rowan's grave was marked by a gardenia bush, and there was a pink ribbon tied around one of the branches. And the undertaker says, "Yes, this is Rowan Morrison's grave. She loved gardenias, so her mother had a gardenia bush be her marker, and the pink ribbon was one of her favorite hair ribbons when she was alive," he says to the detective. And then Detective Howie asks the undertaker, "Where can I obtain a warrant to exhume this grave?" And the undertaker says, "Well, you would have to get a warrant from the mayor of this island himself, Mayor Harold Benson." And then Detective Howie says to the undertaker, "Well, can you arrange it?" And the undertaker says, "Yes, I can. Let me just get to the phone and I'll start arranging the whole thing." And the undertaker walks off. As the undertaker left, Howie began investigating the new section of the cemetery, and he slowly made his way back to the old section. The old section still had their headstones, and the last headstone had a date marked in the 1840s. Well, Howie eventually made his way to the ruins of the old stone church. There was something hauntingly beautiful about this ruin, as the vines that cover it were now sprouting new leaves, giving it a light green color. As he made his way to the area of what used to be the altar, he sees sitting near it was a young woman that was breastfeeding her newborn baby. She sees the detective and lets out a smile and says to the detective, "Good morning, detective. It's a very beautiful morning to be out here." The detective just silently walked by the woman, and he made his way to the altar, and there he sees in the altar several crates of apples and pears. Some of them rotted away, some of them were partially eaten, probably by wild animals. And there, on the altar, to Howie's dismay, were several ornately carved wooden idols. They were the idols of the gods that the locals on the island worship. Well, Howie quickly threw out all the idols from the altar, and then he smashed one of the empty crates and took 2 pieces of the wood from the smashed crate and made a makeshift cross. He puts it on the altar and starts praying loudly, frightening the young woman that was breastfeeding. Later on, Howie was riding a golf cart on his way to the mansion of the mayor of Summer Isle, Mayor Harold Benson. It was a rough ride through the cobblestone roads, but it was a very beautiful scenic ride, as he could see the fields full of beautiful apple and pear blossoms that gave such a wonderful beauty to this island. And as they neared Summer Isle's home, Howie can hear the sound of some sort of chanting and singing going on. He looks around to see if he could spot it, and he spotted it there in the fields near the mansion. There was a makeshift altar to a giant stone statue of some god, and there were young women naked, and they were being led by a woman who was cladded in white robes, barely covered herself. And then how we recognized the woman in the white robes. It was none other than Mrs. Benson, the school teacher. And then the girls began to dance around a small fire, and then they began to leap over the fire one by one. Well, finally, the golf cart pulls up to the mansion of the mayor of the island. Howie thanks the driver, and he gets off the golf cart. As he gets to the mansion, he rings the doorbell and a butler opens up. The butler leads Howie to the main living room of the mansion. And there he could see a man was sitting on a chair facing the other way. And then the man gets up, turns around, and introduces himself. And he says, "Ah, Detective Howie, we finally meet at last. I've heard everything about you," said the mayor. And then the mayor introduced himself. "My name is Harold Benson. I am the mayor of this island." Mayor Benson was a man in his early 30s. He had brown curly hair that was a little bit thin on the top. He was 6'1", average build, and he had brown eyes. And then he says to the detective, "Well, Howie, what do you think of our local custom?" He says to the detective, and he explains that those girls were doing a fertility ritual, jumping over the fire to have a baby. And then Detective Howie says, "But they're naked." And the mayor says, "Well, they have to do it naked. It's safer than doing it with your clothes on." And then the mayor says to Detective Howie, "Well, doesn't the sight of young people not rejuvenate you, reinvigorate you, fill you with hope?" And then the mayor goes over to his piano and quickly plays the first few notes of the song that the girls were singing outside. Then Detective Howie gets right down to business, and he says, "Well, Mr. Mayor, I need a warrant to exhume the grave of Rowan Morrison so I could have it shipped back to the mainland and get a coroner's report." And Mayor Benson says, "That's no problem." And then he goes towards a small desk and pulls out some forms and begins to sign them. And he hands the forms to the detective, and he says to him, "Here you go, Detective Howie, your court order to exhume the body." And then Detective Howie says to the mayor, "Well, if you excuse me for saying so, Mayor, I find your attitude towards this whole thing a bit on the not concerned side. You show no concern that a child may have been possibly murdered on your island." And the mayor says to the detective, "Well, I find it hard to believe that someone got murdered on our island. I mean, we are deeply religious people, and we really hadn't had such a violent crime on this island for, I don't even know how long," he says to the detective. And then Detective Howie says angrily to the mayor, "Religious people? You call what's going on here religious?" And then the mayor says to Detective Howie, "Well, Detective, I'm sorry that our religious beliefs are offensive to you, but we on Summer Isle worship the old gods." And then Howie angrily says, "And what about the true God, the Christian God?" And then the mayor says, "Well, he had his chance, and let's just say he blew it and he's gone." And then the mayor begins to tell Howie how the old religion flourished on this island, and he goes on to explain to the detective, "Well, my great 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 grandfather, Josiah Benson, discovered these isles back in 1809 when Maine was still part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. There wasn't much on these islands. Vegetation was very sparse, and the soil didn't look like it was conducive to growing things here. After he discovered these isles, people began to move out here, but the only thing they can do was herd sheep and fish. But then that all changed. After the War of 1812, Josiah Benson returned out here around 1817, and he began to study the soil samples and made a very big discovery. He discovered that the soil was volcanic, rich with nutrients, and that the Gulf Stream passed right by this island. This island was ripe for an experiment he had in mind. Josiah Benson was a very brilliant scientist, and he had been working on a new strain of apple and pear trees that could grow in very, how should I say, harsh environments. And the mayor goes on to further explain. Then Josiah Benson, armed with typical American scientific zeal, began to plant his new breed of apple and pear trees, and he also began a social experiment. He was fascinated with ancient pagan religions, especially the ancient Celtic religions of Druidism, and he had done extensive research on it and tried to reconstruct it. So he decided to take what knowledge he had gained from his research into Druidism and introduce it to the population of the island to show them that the old gods were still alive and more powerful than the Christian God, and that they can make this barren island bear fruit. Well, of course, everyone was doubtful, but as soon as the fruits began to grow and other vegetables planted by Josiah from his special strain that he made, the people quickly converted to the old Celtic Druidic faith, and sure enough, all the Christian ministers left this island within a decade and a half, and Christianity pretty much died out by mid-century, he says to the detective. And then the mayor goes on to explain that he was raised in this way along with all the other islanders. And then Detective Howie says, I don't believe this. In this Christian nation, there is an island full of heathens. And then the mayor says to Howie, now, Detective, this is not a Christian nation, and this country was not founded as a Christian nation, for the founding fathers were very weary and tired of religion meddling in government affairs. And last I checked, in the Constitution, there was still a separation of church clause, and also there was a freedom of religion clause. And then the mayor says one more thing to the detective, saying to him, and I am tired of you evangelical Christians trying to turn this nation into a theocracy where no one has any freedom of anything. Then Detective Howie goes into a loud political tirade against the mayor, and then the mayor rings for the butler, and he says to the detective, all right, Detective Howie, you made your point clear. Just do your job and leave this island, and leave us alone, he says to the detective, and then the detective was escorted out. Later that night, at the new section of the cemetery, the undertaker Arthur was exhuming the body of Rowan Morrison. Standing near was Detective Howie, as he was watching the exhumation closely. Then the Undertaker's shovel hits the coffin. The Undertaker quickly sweeps away the remaining dirt and begins the process of lifting up the coffin from the hole. After he did that, then with his pry bar, he opens the coffin, and to Howie's shock, there wasn't a body of a child in there. It was just a dead rabbit, and the Undertaker lets out a loud laughter. Howie was very angry that he was on a wild goose chase. He was going to find out what was going on this godforsaken island. A few moments later, at the mansion of Mayor Benson, the mayor was sitting playing piano while his wife, the school teacher, Mrs. Benson, was laying on the bearskin rug, singing along to the song that her husband was playing on the piano. Then the moment was interrupted as Howie comes storming into the living room, carrying the carcass of the rabbit by its ears. Then he throws it onto the bearskin rug next to Mrs. Benson, and Mrs. Benson says, looking at the dead rabbit, Oh, poor Rowan Morrison. She sure did love to run around the fields. And then Howie says angrily, I don't know what you people are up to, but this is sacrilege, he says, screaming to the mayor. And then the mayor says back to Howie, no, it's not sacrilege, detective, because the church no longer is used for a religious ceremony. So we could bury anyone who we choose to bury there, people or animal. And then Howie says angrily, I don't care. I'm going to get to the bottom of what's going on here, and you people will pay dearly if you are hindering my investigation. Then Howie storms off from the room. He returns to the inn and he asks the bartender, when will dinner be ready? And the bartender says, it'll be ready in 5 minutes, detective. And then Detective Howie just decides to walk around to cool off a little bit from what he had experienced. There he had noticed a wall on the far end of the tavern, and he saw the pictures of all the harvest photos dating back to the late 80s. And he had noticed that all the harvest photos had a picture of a young girl dressed like a queen. They were probably between the ages of 11 and 12 years old, just like the age of Rowan Morrison, and they were surrounded by the bountiful harvest. And he had also noticed that one of the pictures were missing, the picture for the 2012 harvest. And he asked the bartender what happened to it, and the bartender just simply said, oh, it fell down and now it's getting a new frame. But instead of shrugging it off, all it did was pique Howie's curiosity. And then he asked the bartender, who takes these harvest photos? And then the bartender just simply answered back, oh, that's Mr. Downing. He's our resident photographer. He owns a photo shop just down the road from here. Howie made a mental note to visit the photographer in the morning. After he ate his dinner, he goes up to his room, and as he was getting dressed into his pajamas, he hears a knock on the door. Howie answers the door, and it was the innkeeper's daughter, Belle. And she was scantily dressed, just wearing a small pink bathrobe that was undone in the front, revealing her semi-nude front end, and she was trying to seduce Howie, and Howie barks at her saying that he doesn't believe in sex before marriage and that he was engaged to a good, God-fearing woman. And then Belle says to Howie, oh, you Christian men are all the same. Oh, no sex before marriage, no this and that. You Christians are the biggest hypocrite. I don't know how many of you Christian men are always the first one to give in to temptation. And then Howie says to her, please leave my room, and please cover yourself up and act like a decent woman. And then he slams the door in her face. Belle goes to her room next door and pounds on the wall, saying to Howie, don't worry, Howie, I'm right next door when your sexual urges get the best of you. The next morning, Howie was walking down the cobblestone roads of the town. He was on his way to the photographer's studio. And as he was walking down the sidewalk, he was just looking at the different storefronts that he was walking by. But there was one store that really offended him. It was after he walked past the pharmacy, he saw the store. It was a potion shop. And he says, my God, a potion shop. Oh, dear God in heaven, says Howie aloud. And then he lets out a quick prayer. God, help free these people of the satanic trappings they found themselves in. Amen. And then he finally makes his way to the photo studio. And there he meets Mr. Downing. And he asks Mr. Downing the slew of questions. And, of course, just like everybody else in the town, Mr. Downing never heard of a Rowan Morrison. Well, Howie leaves the photo studio angry, and then he decides to leave the island and return reinforcements. He returns to the inn where the bartender asks him, so detective, are you going to leave the island because tomorrow's our May Day celebration and you might get offended by it? And then Detective Howie says to the bartender, yes, I got a few more things to do, and then I'm packing and leaving first thing tomorrow morning. So while in his room, Howie was packing his belongings, and then he decided to sit down and watch some TBN, followed by a dose of Fox News. After he was finished, he was sending some text messages to some people, and then he goes to bed. The next morning, he wakes up and heads down to the dock. He gets into his boat and he tries to start it up. but the boat won't start. Then he gets on his radio, and the radio wasn't working. It was very suspicious. And then Howie gets off the boat, and he asks a bunch of the men that were hanging around the dock, did any of you tamper with this? If you did, you're in serious trouble. This is county property, he says sternly. And the men just shrug their shoulders, saying, well, I don't know. No, I didn't touch it. Did you touch it? No, I didn't touch it. I don't know. Then Howie grabs his smartphone and tries to make a call, but he couldn't get any signal. As he was fiddling with his smartphone to see why he had no signal, unbeknownst to him, a group of people wearing masks quickly rise up from their hiding place behind a stone wall, and Howie felt like he was being watched, and as he turned around to the direction where the feeling was coming from, the people quickly ducked back down behind the wall. Then Howie storms from the dock angrily. He makes it back to the inn and he tells the bartender that he'll need his same room back and don't ask him any questions. Then he storms up to his room. Later, Howie begins to investigate the goings-on of the village. He sees in one area that the mayor, along with his wife and the bartender and his daughter and several other people, were getting ready for the festivities, getting the decorations finished and putting the final touches on their elaborate costumes. Well, Howie decides to use this time to go to the photo studio. He breaks into the photo studio and searches the harvest photos until he found the one for last year, 2012. And to his shock, he sees the missing girl. Rowan Morrison was the harvest queen of 2012, but around her there was no harvest. Just maybe a few crates barely filled with cabbages and other veggies, but there was no apples and pears. The crates for them were completely empty, and then Howie realized, my God, they had a catastrophic crop failure last year. And then it dawned on him, maybe these pagan weirdos have some sort of nefarious plan for her. And then his determination to find her and save her was now doubled. So Howie begins his search at the public library. Since he had no internet connection, he had to investigate Celtic paganism and the pagan origin of May Day the old-fashioned way, via books. He had poured through many of the books in the library until he found one about the history of May Day and the history of Celtic paganism. And there he learned that the Celtic Druids used to do human sacrifices, and then Howie thought to himself, they wouldn't. Not in this day and age would they be that stupid. And then he thought to himself, they would be that stupid. Then he puts all the books back and leaves the library. He begins to search for Rowan Morrison. He searches in the dockyards in the other end of the island, where the ships bound for the mainland were shipping their crops. He searched the individual ships that were there, and he searched the buildings, but they all turned up empty. Then he goes to other parts of the island, but also were empty, which left the only other places to search were private residences, but without a warrant, that was a no-go. So he returns to the inn, and he tells the innkeeper that he was going to take a nap. So Howie lays down on the bed and quickly falls asleep. But soon his nap was disturbed by the sound of the loud whisperings of father and daughter plotting on what to do with the detective. He pretended to be asleep. All he could hear from their whisper was the word "hand of glory," and he could hear the daughter tiptoeing into his room, set something by the night table, and quickly walk off. Howie quickly opened his eyes, and to his horror, it was a severed hand covered in candle wax, and each of the individual fingers were lit. Howie quickly sweeps the hand off the night table, and the severed hand falls on the ground with the lit fingers going out. And that was it. Howie decided the time to act was now. As the bartender was getting into his costume, Howie knocked him out cold and took his costume and put it on. It was very convenient that it fit Howie. So now he decides to sneak in, disguised, to the festivities. They were starting to begin the parade, and they soon began marching down the orchards and forested walkways. Leading the parade was none other than the mayor himself, dressed in drag and wearing woad on his face. As they were walking down the forested walkways, they come out to a clearing in the forest, and there in the clearing there were several tall stone carvings of their gods. And then the mayor turns around and announces to the people, "It is time to begin the chopping." And soon, several men that were out there waiting quickly draw out their swords and form a star. And the people began to chant the word, "Chop! Chop! Chop!" And each member of the procession goes to the blade, and the star-shaped blades go right over their head. And soon they duck and leave. It was a sadistic game of chance. One person was going to lose their head. And sure enough, when it was Howie's turn, who was still in disguise, the mayor says, "Come on, everyone must take a chance," thinking that the disguised Howie was the bartender. And so Howie was praying in his mind that he was not going to lose his head. The blades went over his head, nothing. He left. But then the one behind him, somebody dressed like a rabbit, gets their head cut off. And then everybody started gasping. Howie was ready to run over to whoever lost her head, but soon the person in the rabbit disguise real head emerged, and everyone began laughing. It was only the helmet of the costume that got cut off, and Howie breathed a brief sigh of relief. And then the mayor says to everybody, "All right, people, let's go down to the seaside." And the procession goes all the way down to the seaside. At the rocky beach, there was a horse-drawn wagon. The wagon was beautifully decorated, and the horses that pulled the wagon were beautiful Clydesdale, and on the wagon were several barrels of ale. And next to the wagon were several workers that probably had brought the ale to the beach. And then the mayor separates from the crowd, and he gets onto the carriage, and he begins some sort of ceremony to offer the ale to the sea. And he says aloud, "O mighty Lear, great sea, we offer you the finest ale in return for favorable growing weather and the finest fishes for catching." Then the mayor grabs an axe and smashes the barrels of ale, and the men that were with the horses quickly push the broken barrels into the waters. As soon as the ale hits the water, they begin to foam, and foam began flying all over the place. After the offering was done, then the mayor announces, "Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for our sacrifice." And sure enough, another horse-drawn carriage comes out from a cave, and there was Rowan Morrison tied to a post. And then Howie made his move. He ran violently, shoving people out of his way, and he got to where Rowan was tied up at. He takes out a knife, and he cuts Rowan free, and he says to her, "Come on, we need to get out of here." And she says, "I couldn't agree with you more, sir. These people are crazy. They want to sacrifice me." Then Howie draws out his gun, pointing to the crowd, screaming at them, "All right, people, get back. Me and the girl are getting off of this island." And the two ran into a nearby cave. Well, the cave was going upwards. As they were climbing the rocks, they finally emerged from the other end of the cave to the cliffs overlooking the seaside. There, Howie was surprised. The mayor, who was now out of the drag but still had his wood makeup on, was waiting there with everybody that Howie just left behind. And without warning, Rowan Morrison pulls out a knife and cuts the hand of Howie that was holding the gun, causing him to drop it. Then Rowan quickly grabs the gun and runs over to the mayor, and she asks the mayor, "How did I do, sir?" And the mayor lets out a big smile and he says, "You did wonderful, child. You did very well." And Howie, who was nursing the cut hand, asked him, "What's going on here?" And then the mayor says, "Well, detective, as your investigation has shown you, we had a catastrophic crop failure last year, and we can't have a repeat of last year," said the mayor. And then he goes on to say, "So we needed a sacrifice. And I can't do animal sacrifices. I love animals," said the mayor. "But," the mayor goes on to explain, "there was one sacrifice I knew would surely work, and that was a human sacrifice." So we arranged everything to get somebody out here to be sacrificed, and sure enough, it was you. And Howie says to the mayor, "Oh, you can't lay a hand on me. I'm a sheriff's detective. You will be in serious trouble." And then the mayor says to Howie, "Everything's been taken care of." And Howie says, "What do you mean?" And then the mayor says, "We have members of a religion in your sheriff's department," he says, "and they're taking care of everything to make sure that your disappearance is handled appropriately. They're the ones that set you up." And then Howie says, "The reason why your crops failed was because the Gulf Stream failed. And when the Gulf Stream failed, your crops failed because nothing was meant to grow on these islands." And then the mayor signaled for a bunch of men to come and tackle Howie and take him away. Howie began kicking and screaming, and he says, "Killing me won't bring back your damn apples and pears. It's just gonna make matters worse. Your crops failed because you turned away from God. And it was he who laid waste to your fields. And it was he who caused the Gulf Stream to fail. And if you kill me, you will be condemned to everlasting hellfire. Turn back from your wayward ways." Then Howie saw a very terrifying sight to behold. It was a giant man-shaped wicker cage, and he let out a loud primordial scream as he struggled even more, and he knew what that was reserved for. And soon the men tied him up, and they put him inside the giant man-shaped wicker cage. And then the mayor began to do a ceremony, and there was suddenly a marching band that appeared, and the marching band began to play music as the men were now going to light the Wicker Man. Howie let out a scream and began to pray aloud and saying aloud to the mayor, "You know, Mayor, this is not going to work, and you'll still have to keep sacrificing people until it's you one day, Mayor, that has to be sacrificed." And the mayor assured the crowd that his sacrifice were going to bring back the crops. And sure enough, the flames rose. As the flames began to consume the giant Wicker Man, Howie just let out another loud prayer, asking God to avenge his death. As the flames rose, the flames finally consumed the Wicker Man as Howie let out a blood-curdling scream. And the crowd were cheering and singing "Summer's a-Coming" as the sun was beginning to set. And finally, the burning Wicker Man caved in. And it was the end for poor Detective Howie. Like and subscribe. The end.